Welcome back. This is News in Focus. My name is Faraz Patel. We say Jazakallah to you, the viewer, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. Now, this year, amid Israel's continuous genocide that is occurring in Gaza, countries have continued to join in their recognition of Palestine. Armenia, Slovenia, Ireland, Norway, Spain, the Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica and Barbados are among those, reflecting the growing international support. Today, of course, the world observes the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, which was established by the United Nations in 1977 to emphasize global support for Palestinian rights, including self-determination, independence, and a resolution to the issue of the Palestinian refugees. Now, recognizing Palestine strengthens its global standing, improves its capacity to hold Israeli authorities accountable for the occupation, especially now with last week's ICC arrest warrants occurring, and pressure Western powers to act on what some are calling for a two-state solution. Joining us now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Dalal Iriqat, who is an Associate Professor of Diplomacy and Conflict Resolution at the Arab American University in Palestine. Dr. Iriqat, assalamu alaikum. Shukran so much for joining us here on a very historic day for Palestine, but also a somber one, given that the death toll for the genocide in Gaza continues to rise.
Thank you very much. Walaikum assalam. On the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, I would like to express a message of gratitude to South Africa and to the different countries who stood solidly with the Palestinian cause, with every student, with every protester, with every physician, every doctor, every journalist who had spoken the truth and who had stood on the side of humanity and international law in the past year. Yes, this past year had been painful. On the Palestinian level, we had more than 43,000 souls martyred by the Israeli military occupation in Gaza alone, and more than 750 civilians also martyred by the Israeli occupation in the West Bank. The reality is very, very daunting. Settler colonialism is being very entrenched on the ground. The Israeli military occupations, racist policies, apartheid, extrajudicial killings, detentions are also at stake. So the Palestinians are really facing a very dark moment in history in 2024. However, the messages, the solidarity, the demonstrations, the cases that South Africa and other like-minded countries did and delivered at the ICJ and the ICC give us hope and give us more hope for a better days, because there are certain political systems, there are the people who are still standing for the truth and for the facts and for humanity, and justice shall prevail one day because of the actions of those people. So again, on behalf of the Palestinian people, I would like to send a message of gratitude, respect to South Africa and the like-minded countries who not only recognize the Palestinian state, but who were very courageous to stand in face of genocide, to stand in face of the war crimes, and to say what should have been said in 2024. As those countries claim to be civilized and claim to be democratic, while they are committing war crimes against the Palestinian people. The war crimes in the past year were unfortunately documented on screens, yet Israel is still enjoying impunity. We are hopeful, with the support and the solidarity of the conscious human beings and political systems around the world, that justice shall prevail and the Israeli military criminals will be held to account, and Palestine will witness and live freedom and justice very soon.
No, it's an absolute pleasure from a South African perspective. And of course, in the next segment, we are going to touch on those ICC and ICJ cases. But from the International Day of Solidarity, Dr. Iriqat, I mean, what we have seen in the last year is the countries, the momentum that has really been gathered by the countries has been outstanding, especially countries you would not have thought of. I mean, we look at the United States of America. I mean, you had protesters going right up until Wall Street, protesting corporates that are actually funding America, and by and large also America funding Israel in terms of arms supplies. But that really shows that the world is starting to understand really the cause of the Palestinians. I mean, not many people were really educated, prior to October the 7th. Now the education continues to grow, given that they now understand what the Nakba is and what it has done in terms of displacing the Palestinian people.
Well, this past year and the documented war crimes that the Israeli military authorities had committed against the Palestinian civilians in Gaza and continue to do in the West Bank are just, there is no more argument. I mean, everybody knows what is right and what is wrong. And the fact that Israel is now being sued at the ICJ is a great moment for history. It's a great moment for South Africa. It's a great moment for people who call for justice and for humanity and for human rights. On the public diplomacy level, I have to stress the fact that the people who demonstrated all around the capitals in the world, the students who protested on campuses in the US and around the world, their demonstrations and their voices matter. And what they are doing for justice and for holding the criminals accountable is very, very important for history. Yet, this year had also shown how some single countries are manipulating the international world order. We had seen how there was a UN Security Council resolution for ceasefire in Gaza. And I am here referring to 2735. Yet, with the American veto, with the American continued vetoes, those resolutions could not have been implemented. We now have arrest warrants against Israeli criminals. The Prime Minister of Israel is now labeled as a criminal. You know, all the member states, the 124 member states in the ICC should respect and be obliged to arrest the war criminals once they land on their lands. So we are hopeful that the ICC and the ICJ continued effort will be translated on the ground with the will and the steadfastness and the demonstration of the conscious political systems, which is reflected by the public opinion of those countries. Again, public diplomacy matters. Unfortunately, the official diplomacy had failed the humanity in the past year. However, I am confident as a professor of diplomacy that public diplomacy and people's opinion matter. And by time, it will be reflected on their foreign policy. This year, despite the daunting moments and the genocide that we had seen against the Palestinian people in Gaza, gave also another hope and trust in the international legal and diplomatic tools. What we had seen in the ICJ in January and what we had seen in the ICJ ruling in July for the illegality of the Israeli military occupation and the need to end the military occupation and the need on recognizing the Palestinian state with a framework, give hope to people who believe in justice, who believe in diplomacy and international law.
Doctor, I want to touch on the boycott and sanctions that have been, obviously, the pressurization that has been coming there. I mean, just this week, Puma, one of the big sports apparel companies, has now pulled out of Israel. We see conglomerates like McDonald's, Starbucks now really dropping in terms of their revenue. The fact that these companies, even now, when they put up, one sentence as saying that we are all for peace and that, they're still not condemning what Israel is doing right now in Gaza. And I know there's obviously a big BDS movement that is happening in your town of Ramallah, as well as here in South Africa. How has that really taken up a whole new level, given that companies who want to associate themselves with Israel are truly paying the price?
So when we talk about boycott and sanction, I would like to stress the point that this comes under the framework of coercive diplomacy. So those countries who are showing solidarity, the political systems that are voting in favor of Palestine, for example, 143 countries just voted in September at the UN for the Palestinian state to realize and the illegality of the Israeli military occupation that must end. Those the statements should have another dimension of diplomacy measures where we would need to see some trade and commercial sanctions practiced on Israel, because Israel cannot continue to enjoy impunity as they are committing war crimes against the Palestinian civilians and everything is documented. So the voting at the UN is very important, the ICJ is very important, the ICC is very important, yet the recognition, despite its urgency and its need, it needs to be paralleled with practical bilateral diplomatic tools where those countries should impose economic sanctions on Israel. Talking about the companies itself, it's another layer of the coercive diplomacy and the sanctions that those countries are obliged to translate in respect of their international law. When there is a company that operates on a settlement, for example, according to UN Security Council Resolution 2334, this is illegal, full stop. And the countries, the member states, are simply expected to stop those companies from operating on settlements. For example, when settlements products are still shelved in different supermarkets around the world, this should not be tolerated. Again, when there are certain universities that operate on settlements.
Okay, we seem to have lost Dr. Iriqat. We hope to get her after the break. Do stay tuned to News in Focus. We'll be back after this break. Welcome back to News in Focus. Dr. Iriqat has joined us again. Of course, technology and its challenges. Dr. Iriqat, shukran so much for staying with us. I want to go back to, of course, diplomacy. The fact that we've seen in the United Nations Security Councils where we have, majority of the nations voting in favor of a ceasefire, and the United States of America. Now, I want to touch on the United States of America because they really have been the biggest hurdle in getting a ceasefire through. Vetoes among vetoes. And I'm sure as a Palestinian people, there is frustration that if they had vetoed an original first Security Council resolution just last year, this would have, of course, reduced the amount of lives that were lost. How big of an issue does America play in really being the stumbling block in getting not just a ceasefire, but immediate aid into Gaza?
Well, the U.S. role in shielding the Israeli war crimes has been evident. It had been documented. And when we speak about the U.S. role, we had seen how the financial support came from the USA, the strategic support came from the USA, the military equipment support came from the USA, and the legal shielding at the UN and the different platforms also came from the USA. So the USA complicity in supporting the Israeli war crimes had been evident, had been proved, and had been documented. The thing is, this is a question that the American administration should face in the protests and on the campuses and in the different cities of the US, where some people are aware now of the injustices that the US is supporting. When we have an ICJ ruling for plausibility of Israel in genocide, the Palestinian people rest their case. And again, we are grateful for the conscious countries, led by South Africa and the different other countries in Latin America and Europe, who not only supported the legal files in the ICJ and the ICC, but went upwards to recognizing the Palestinian state, to challenging the international world order, and to step forward for justice, for international law, for humanity, to say the least. And the fact that Israel needs to be held accountable and that Netanyahu cannot continue to enjoy impunity is a big proof that it was only the US that had shielded the Israeli war crimes in the different UN platforms, especially the Security Council.
Dr. Iriqat, now we've got these ICC arrest warrants that happened last week, and obviously this being a historic moment in terms of justice for the Palestinian people. But again, you've got the USA saying that the ICC now is becoming a court that doesn't really matter. The irony, of course, just last year when this very same court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, they lauded the ICC as probably the best court that has ever existed on this earth. The hypocrisy is there for all to see. And that, I think, really shows a sense of frustration that the United States of America, which will always be this big stumbling block, now again is not only backing Israel in terms of appealing this ICC case, but also at the same time, they will do what they can to sanction the ICC. And that in itself just shows you that this big Western power, or this Western power that calls itself a democracy, really isn't showing themselves out to be that way.
So this year had also showed us how, unfortunately, politics plays a great role in the international law system. Yes, you have mentioned how arrest warrants, for example, were issued against Putin. And we did see the double standards in the world's reactions and the state's reactions to the arrest warrants that have been recently issued against Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, and Yoav Gallant. So yes, there is hypocrisy, there are double standards in the application. However, When we go back to the text, to Article 37 of the ICC and the Rome Statute, it clearly spells out the responsibility and the obligation, the non-contested obligation of every member state at the ICC in upholding, respecting, and implementing the ICC decisions. It has been hard for any conscious citizen in the past year to have witnessed how politics really played a major role, and like the power politics played a major role, and the double standards that some countries had demonstrated. I really wish that the different EU countries, especially in the European Union, will stand up to their values and to their universality, to their principles, in showing the world that humanity matters, in standing for humanity, for justice, for international law, and not, showing the world that they are practicing double standards, again, depending on the parties that are involved when it comes to different decisions.
Dr. Iriqat, as we reflect on today, of course, when we look at what is currently happening in Gaza, of course, words like conflict and war get thrown around, and it seems that when this narrative is being pushed, it's being pushed that, Hamas is this big, great army that's going to take on, Israel. But when we look at the definition of war, this would mean, of course, that Hamas would have things like jets or tanks or battleships, which is, of course, not the case. They are acting as a resistant movement. This really is the part of the education that the world needs to understand, that what Israel is doing right now does not really constitute war. And when we look at the prima facie evidence that is coming from the ICJ, it shows that there is plausibility. And plausibility means, well, we're nearly 60 or 80% there for those who really want to look at law. When one looks at the definition of conflict, really, the word conflict needs to be taken out, because this is really not a conflict. It really is one side pounding, bombing, destroying a mass civilian population. Just this morning, 42 or people, even more counting, when we look at Beit Lahia, when we look at the bombings in Gaza City, when we look what's happening in the north, those narratives are changing, isn't it? Because the world needs to understand that the word conflict cannot really be used in a situation like this.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I need to explain to your audiences that what's happening in Gaza, what we're witnessing for the past year, is not a war between Israel and Hamas. This has been a series of war crimes, literally a genocide, as the ICJ had ruled for plausibility, against the Palestinian right to self-determination. This has been systematic, not only for 1 year. This has been systematic by the Israeli military occupation for more than 7 decades. For 76 years, Israeli military occupation had come with a package under apartheid, under racism, under extrajudicial killings, under administrative arbitration on daily basis. If you look at the West Bank alone in the past year, you would see some evidence that what Israel is doing is not actually targeting Hamas as they claim. They had been working on the settler colonial project in the West Bank, like they had been trying to destroy the Palestinian civilian existence in Gaza. The target of Israel is a colonial settler power. They want to eradicate the Palestinian identity. They want to rid the Palestinians from their right to self-determination. And here comes the significance of today. The 29th of November, at the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. This day came in commemoration of the Resolution 181, which stresses on the importance of bringing about the two-state solution. The Palestinian state must see light. And today, the world is standing, on this day in solidarity to remind those states in their obligation and responsibility, morally and legally speaking, in bringing the state to reality. And when we say the Palestinian state, we're not only talking about the recognition of the Palestinian state. With all its importance, we are talking about the sovereignty of the Palestinian people, the political embedded right of the Palestinian people in enjoying their right to self-determination. So when we say there is an ICC and ICJ ruling, we are expecting from every member state that is calling for the two-state solution to respect their legal and moral responsibilities in recognizing the Palestinian state, in ending the Israeli military occupation, in defining the border of the long-recognized state of Israel, and in imposing coercive diplomacy through sanctions, through their bilateral relations with Israel. Any cooperation with the settlements, no matter what, whether it is companies, trade, shelves, their citizens living in settlements should be put to a halt right now because they are illegal under UN resolutions. What is expected from the international member states of the different bodies today is to act upon their statements. The rhetoric that we had been hearing as Palestinians for the past 30 years about the two-state solution, about justice, about prosperity, and about security and stability in the Middle East cannot see light unless every member state of this international world order recognizes that the root cause for conflicts and for instability in the region is the Israeli military occupation that needs to end. The Palestinian people deserve to live in liberty, justice, freedom, and independence. And this should stop the Israeli military occupation. And that's when we see the stability and security and peace in the Middle East.
Dr. Iriqat, unfortunately, we have run out of time. Shukran so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV. Much appreciated. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Shukran. Wa alaikum assalam.
That's Dr. Dalal Iriqat, Associate Professor of Diplomacy and Conflict Resolution at the Arab American University in Palestine. Well, that's all we have for you here on News in Focus. From myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Do have yourself a good weekend, but most importantly, a safe one. Stay beautiful, South Africa. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.